I've never been a big fan of pain. Suffering is pain that has been extended. So, protracted pain is suffering. Little pains along the way, that's just life. But when those little pains stack up and add up and they get extended, that's what suffering is. I think I'm not very much different than most people that I know. I suppose there are some athletes who they kind of enjoy the pain of training. Most, I'm told, don't. The reason they do it is because they have their eye on the prize and they know they can't get there without going through the pain, the suffering of training. In some ways, that is a pretty good metaphor for what growing up and maturing in Christ is all about. The suffering that we sometimes experience, the pain that we encounter, is not some random punishment necessarily, although it could be, as it is more often the process of training us to become more and more like Jesus. When these kinds of suffering and pain and this whole thing happens to us, one of the ways to explain it is we're in a fallen world. Thank you, Adam and Eve. Now, because of that one act, all of us for the rest of time are going to experience this kind of bad stuff. Well, a second aspect of that is, I think there are three aspects. The second aspect is I bring on the majority of the pain that I experience in my life, I bring on to myself. And then a third category is pain and suffering that I experience because of decisions others have made. Peter is very direct about this whole issue of suffering as a part of life, and in particular, suffering as a part of the life of a follower of Jesus. In fact, we've been looking at this passage beginning in verse 19 for a few times, and we're almost done. Here's what he wrote. Pardon me. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. In other words, do not be surprised when you encounter suffering, because our model, Jesus, left us an example. His example of enduring the suffering, and yes, the suffering of the cross, the suffering of the humiliation, the physical pain involved in the scourging, the nails through his hands and feet, an excruciating death, agonizing death by asphyxiation, and from an exploded heart. It's all that is suffering in the extreme. I don't imagine I will ever have to suffer in that particular kind of way. But when I do suffer, I get to choose my response to it. I've talked about Viktor Frankl before. He was a Jewish psychotherapist who lived in Vienna, Austria in the 1940s. If you know anything about history, especially World War II history, you know that Vienna was a difficult place for Jews in the 1940s because of the Nazis and their program to purge the world of the Jewish race. He was taken to a prison camp in fact, more than one different prison camps, and he endured. What he endured there gave him insight into human behavior and the heart and mind of men and women. One of his conclusions was, when we have a sense of purpose, we can endure nearly anything. And what gives us this sense of purpose is our ability to choose the meaning that we will assign to the events that happen to us. In other words, one of the things that he said was the Nazis could take everything from him. They could take his clothing. They could take his, they could beat him. They could do any number of things. They took his freedom. But what they could not take from him was his ability to choose what he would do about what has happened to him. We have that choice. God has given us this choice. It's part of our gift of free will. And for us, we get to choose the meaning that we will assign to the suffering that we experience. Jesus is our example. In the book of Hebrews, it says that Jesus scorned the suffering because he knew the outcome. Well, there's lots to think about that. Christ left us an example so that we could follow in his steps. And then he goes on in verse 22, he committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. In other words, he was innocent. And it wasn't like, well, he didn't quite do what they said he did. He was completely innocent. And he never even tried to defend himself. Verse 23, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. And he suffered. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. This is a narrative, a reflective narrative of the trial and the beatings and the crucifixion of Jesus. During his kangaroo court trial, he hardly spoke any words. None of his words were in defense of himself. And as a result of that, and the two other things, plan of God and the plan of Satan, he was then given over by Pilate to the Jews, who did what they had wanted to do for a very long time, and that was they put an end to his life. And even in his beatings, even in the humiliation of all of this, even on the cross, Jesus did not insult anyone. Now, if you remember the narrative from the Gospels, you remember that the Jews and the Pharisees and the leaders of the Jewish people hurled insults at Jesus while he hung on the cross. But this is what Jesus, you remember this. What did he say from the cross? Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. Instead of hurling insults, he asked for forgiveness for those who were doing this to him. And see, we have to theologically bear in mind this. We were the ones who were doing this to him, right? Yeah, it was the Jews that directly, they were directly responsible for him hanging on the cross, but it was far beyond them. It was me too. You see, if I had been, and you know this, if I had been the only one who had ever sinned, Jesus still would have gone to the cross, because it was the only way to cure me. The only way for me to have this direct access and for me to be able to enter fully into sonship with God. Well, if we don't realistically look at ourselves in relationship to the suffering of Jesus on the cross, we miss the meaning of the cross. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. One of the difficult things for me to wrap my brain around is the fact that God is absolutely loving and he is absolutely just. It's difficult for me to somehow synthesize those two things, because love, there are times when love would want justice for the loved one, when they have been, when wrong has been done against them. Okay, it makes sense that love would want justice for them. But what about when they have done wrong toward others? Sometimes love would want justice in order to get the attention of the wrongdoer and direct them back in the way of truth. Okay. But mercy and grace, somehow, they intervene so that justice doesn't get done. See, mercy is us not getting what we deserve. So, in other words, mercy means we don't get justice. Grace means we get what we couldn't deserve. It's even a step further, if you will, than mercy. So how does God, this God of grace, mercy, and love, how is he also a God of justice? He judges justly. Not sure I don't think I can synthesize those things, but I have to somehow accept that he is. And what Jesus did was he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. This, for us, is also part of his example. This is part of what we should follow his steps in. When we are experiencing what feels like or what may actually be injustice in our lives, when we feel that we are suffering unjustly, what is our first best course? Well, I think the first best course would be to follow in the steps of Jesus, who entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. This is hard. Does it mean that we always just lay down and let whatever is going to happen to us? Wow, I don't know. Do we just let Hitler and Rommel and the tanks roll in and blast us into oblivion? I don't think so. And yet, there is this aspect of following Jesus that is about me entrusting myself to the one who judges justly. If I entrust myself to the one who judges justly, as Jesus did, then part of this, maybe the biggest part of this entrusting, is I leave the outcome with him. And this goes against my grain. Now, if you take this whole thing and you come down from the global view of what about Hitler, what about Mussolini, what about the communists, what about, you bring it down here to the ground level, to the runway, to the things that happen in my life, when I feel I've been judged wrongly, when I feel I'm suffering unjustly in my own personal life. And that's really what Peter's talking about. He's not talking about the broader cultural issues at this point. He's talking about individual things. And that's when I have to entrust myself and the outcomes of this thing that's going on to the one who judges justly. In the long run, and it wasn't just like the eternal long run, it was in a 3-day run, God's justice said, you may do all you think you can do to end his life, but you do not end his life. On the 3rd day, Jesus stepped out of the tomb resurrected to his full, complete God-like godliness. I mean, this was the conquering king who stepped out of the tomb. You didn't end his life. And the one who judges justly brought about that outcome. I don't think I am saying that we need to look forward to this kind of dramatic outcome, that it's always going to come out good. That's not what I'm saying at all. Peter knew better than that in his own life. Listen, his own life demonstrates that when he experienced persecution and suffering as he did, especially if you know what tradition and history tell us about his end, he died as a martyr under Roman rule. The same Romans that he said, we're supposed to submit to the human authorities above us, to the emperor and then to the governor, and that's what he did. And you know what the outcome was his death. He was crucified, and he asked to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel himself worthy to be crucified in the same manner as Jesus. It's not always going to work out great. That's not the point. The point is learning how to entrust ourselves to the one who judges justly. Now, I'd like to unpack that a little bit more next time when we get together on Soul Care with Stevie Boy, but my time is more than up. Again, I don't know how I manage it, but I'm always over. I apologize. Thanks for giving me grace on that. I hope I get to connect with you again this way next time.